In 1935, a group of men who worked at the Electro-Motive Company in McCook, Illinois, a diesel engine manufacturing plant 15 miles southwest of downtown Chicago, started gathering at a bar called Matilda's on Old Route 66. Matilda's, they rode motorcycles. They drank together after their shifts. They were factory workers in a Chicago suburb in the middle of the Great Depression. The bar they gathered at was on a road that had been officially designated U.S. Highway 66 just 9 years earlier, a road that began in Chicago, ran 2,400 miles to Santa Monica, California, and connected the industrial Midwest to the agricultural West in a ribbon of pavement that no American had ever crossed before without significant difficulty. Route. At some point during a field meet, the men from McCook showed up without a name, without a banner, without any of the organizational infrastructure that the other clubs had developed. An announcer looking down at them over a public address system said something that nobody planned and nobody would forget. The announcer said the McCook boys looked like a bunch of outlaws. The men from McCook decided they liked the sound of that. Outlaws. They embroidered the name onto their jackets. They called themselves the McCook Outlaws. And in doing so, 12 years before Hollister, 14 years before the Wild One, 20 years before the AMA issued its famous 99% statement that created the 1%er identity, they became the first organized motorcycle club in America to embrace the outlaw name as their own. To understand why the greatest outlaw motorcycle club in American history was founded in McCook, Illinois, rather than Oakland, California, you have to understand two things. You have to understand what the Electro-Motive Company was, and you have to understand what Route 66 meant. The Electro-Motive Company was founded in 1922 and acquired by General Motors in 1930. It manufactured diesel-electric locomotives, the engines that were replacing steam power on American railroads throughout the 1930s. McCook, Illinois was chosen as the primary manufacturing site because of its location, southwest of Chicago, on the rail lines that radiated from the city in every direction, close to the steel suppliers and machining infrastructure that a locomotive manufacturer required. MCook. The men who worked at Electro-Motive in the 1930s were skilled factory workers in the specific mold that Chicago's industrial corridor produced in that era. Machinists, electricians, welders, men who spent their working hours around enormous machines that operated at precise tolerances and who developed, through that proximity, the specific mechanical intuition that comes from understanding how things are built rather than simply how they are used. Machinists. They rode motorcycles for the same reason that working-class men across the industrial Midwest rode motorcycles in that era, because motorcycles were affordable transportation that offered something automobiles could not: speed, the specific sensation of being in the weather rather than enclosed by sheet metal, and because maintaining a motorcycle was something you could do yourself with the same skills you used at the factory, which meant the machine was fully knowable in a way that a car was not. Speed. Route 66 was their road, not metaphorically, literally. The highway passed through McCook. Old US Highway 66 ran through the village on Joliet Road, past Matilda's bar, past the gas stations and diners that had grown up along its length in the decades since the designation was established. Route 66 was officially commissioned on November 11th, 1926. It ran from Chicago, specifically from the intersection of Michigan Avenue and Jackson Boulevard, to Los Angeles, crossing 8 states and 2,400 miles of American geography. It was the first American highway to be completely paved, end to end. It was the road that Steinbeck called the Mother Road in The Grapes of Wrath, the route the Dust Bowl refugees took westward in the 1930s. Mother Road. For the men at Matilda's bar in 1935, Route 66 was not a symbol. It was the road outside the door. They rode out of the parking lot onto it every time they left. In between, on the southwestern fringe of America's second largest industrial complex, a group of factory workers was building something that would outlast the Depression, outlast the war, outlast the California mythology that would eventually claim credit for what Illinois started. Outlast the founding of the MC Outlaws in 1935 did not happen as an act of rebellion against anything. The AMA had not yet issued its 99% statement. The Hollister incident was 12 years in the future. The wild one was 18 years away. The concept of the 1%er did not exist. What the men from McCook were doing in 1935 was riding motorcycles together on weekends and gathering at a bar on Route 66 afterward. The field meets they attended, motorcycle gatherings in the countryside around Chicago, where clubs competed in races, stunts, and games, were part of a Midwestern motorcycle culture that the national press did not cover, and that the California-centric motorcycle press has almost entirely ignored in its retrospective histories. The Midwest field meet culture of the 1930s is the least documented aspect of American motorcycle history. The clubs that formed around it included the Milwaukee Gypsy Outlaws, who would later join the McCook Group, and the Louisville Gypsy Outlaws. The dozens of Midwestern riding clubs that operated independently of AMA sanctioning have been written out of popular history because they did not have a Hunter Thompson to document them, did not have a Marlon Brando to perform them, and did not have a California sun to photograph them in. John Davis, documented as the McCook Outlaws founder, led a group of electromotive workers who understood machines from the inside out. They did not buy motorcycles because Marlon Brando looked good on one. They rode because they were working-class men in the industrial Midwest who had the mechanical skill to maintain a machine, the physical hardiness to ride it in Illinois weather, and the specific stubbornness of people who build things for a living. The name they chose came from a PA announcer's offhand observation at a field meet. This origin story is documented in the comments of the most watched Outlaws history video on YouTube, posted by a man who identified himself as a 1%er since 1980 with direct knowledge of club history. He wrote, according to longtime members of the AOA, the name came about from a field meet in the 1930s. The announcer said over the PA, "There goes the McCook boys looking like a bunch of outlaws, and the rest is history." They took the description and made it their identity. The patch was a winged motorcycle in the early years, and it was embroidered onto their jackets. The McCook Outlaws were an organized motorcycle club with a name, a patch, and a bar to call home. 12 years before Hollister. On Route 66 in a Chicago suburb. Stop here for one moment. If you know someone who believes California invented everything about motorcycle culture, send them this video right now. The Electro-Motive factory workers at Matilda's bar on Route 66 in 1935. The PA announcer who accidentally named the oldest outlaw motorcycle club in American history. This is the history that California's motorcycle press buried for 90 years. Post it to your Facebook motorcycle groups. Put it in Our Motorcycles and Our Motorcycle Culture and Our Motorcycle History on Reddit. The algorithm shows this video to more people every time someone shares it outside YouTube. Share it before you scroll past. The McCook Outlaws maintained their club through World War II, though activities were limited by gas rationing. Many of the members served. The motorcycle culture that had been building through the 1930s was interrupted by the same war that interrupted everything else. In May 1946, the first major post-war motorcycle event in the Midwest was held at Soldier Field in Chicago. Soldier Field, the same stadium on the lakefront where the Chicago Bears played, was built to reflect the civic ambition of a city that had been positioning itself as the most important inland city in America since the 1880s. A motorcycle event at Soldier Field was not a fringe gathering. It was a statement. The veterans returned to their clubs. Men who had learned to maintain Harley-Davidson motorcycles and military training programs brought back specific mechanical skills that translated directly into civilian riding culture. The McCook Outlaws grew. Membership expanded beyond the original Electro-Motive workers to include riders from across the Chicago metropolitan area. At some point in the late 1940s or early 1950s, the club made a decision that reflected how far it had grown. They changed their name. The McCook Outlaws became the Chicago Outlaws. Chicago in the late 1940s and early 1950s was the second largest city in America. Stockyards, the steel mills on the south side, the meatpacking plants, the rail yards that made Chicago the hub through which every railroad line in the central United States passed. The Chicago Southside chapter became the club's mother chapter in 1964, the organizational anchor for everything that followed. They called it the mothership. The specific character of Chicago motorcycle culture in the 1940s and 1950s was shaped by the city's industrial geography, in the same way that Pennsylvania's coal and steel towns shaped their motorcycle culture. Chicago riders were working men. They worked in factories and yards and plants that required mechanical knowledge as a baseline competency. They maintained their machines themselves because the machines demanded maintenance, and because calling a dealer for a minor repair was not within the economic framework of a factory worker's life. The south side of Chicago is important, specifically. The industrial belt along the Calumet River, the steel mills and manufacturing facilities that employed hundreds of thousands of workers in the post-war period, and the neighborhoods of Bridgeport, Pullman, and South Chicago that house those workers in the density that large industrial employers require, this is the geography that produced the Chicago motorcycle culture the national press never covered. The Chicago Outlaws were South Side industrial workers who rode Harleys on the flat roads of the Chicago metropolitan area and on the roads that opened up as soon as you left the city's density behind. Route 66 headed southwest toward the open country. Route 30 headed east toward Indiana. These were the roads that gave a working-class Chicago rider access to open space without requiring a day's travel to reach. Route 66 did not begin in California. It began in Chicago. At the intersection of Michigan Avenue and Jackson Boulevard, a brass plaque marks the starting point. From there, it ran southwest through the city, through the suburbs, including McCook, through Springfield and St. Louis and Oklahoma City, and Albuquerque and Flagstaff, and into California. The riders who first explored Route 66 in the late 1920s and through the 1930s were Midwestern riders heading west, not California riders heading east. The direction of cultural flow on Route 66 was eastward in the popular imagination, the Dust Bowl refugees moving west, the Steinbeck characters moving west. But the motorcycle culture that used Route 66 as its primary artery was Illinois and Missouri, and Oklahoma culture moving in both directions. The men at Matilda's bar in 1935 were 15 miles from where Route 66 began. When they rode on the road that connected their suburb to everything west of Chicago. They did not need to drive to a road worth riding. The road worth riding started at the door. That specific geographic relationship, founding the oldest outlaw motorcycle club in America on the road that would become the most iconic motorcycle road in American history, is the detail that makes the Illinois story irreducible. You cannot understand Route 66 as a motorcycle cultural artifact without understanding that the oldest outlaw club in America was founded on it, not at its destination, but at its beginning. California got the mythology of Route 66. Chicago built it. The Chicago Outlaws adopted their signature patch, the skull over cross pistons known as Charlie, in the early 1950s. The skull design replaced the wing motorcycle of the original McCook era. The cross pistons were added after the film The Wild One appeared in 1953, influenced by skull and cross pistons imagery from the fictional club Marlon Brando's character led. There is a specific irony here that the popular history of motorcycle culture has never properly acknowledged. The Wild One is credited with creating the visual language of the outlaw biker. Marlon Brando in a leather jacket. This aesthetic dominated motorcycle culture's popular image for the next 30 years. The Wild One was based on the Hollister incident of 1947. The Hollister incident produced the Life magazine photograph, which was staged, and the cultural mythology of the outlaw biker that preceded the film. The AMA responded to Hollister with its 99% statement, and that produced the 1% identity that outlaw clubs later adopted. But the Chicago Outlaws were already wearing the name on their jackets in 1935, 12 years before Hollister. They did not become outlaws because of Life magazine, the AMA, or the Wild One. They were called outlaws by a PA announcer at a field meet, and they decided to make it their own identity without any of the cultural scaffolding the California narrative constructed afterward. When the Wild One appeared and the Outlaws incorporated elements of its visual language into their patch, they were not being influenced by a myth about who they were. They were a club that had been in existence for 18 years incorporating a visual element from a film that had been inspired, indirectly, by a cultural phenomenon that was itself a distorted reflection of practices the Outlaws had been doing since before the distortion existed. The club that predated the myth adopted visual elements from a myth that was inspired by events that happened a decade after the club's founding. The chronology is almost perfectly inverted, and nobody covering motorcycle history has stated that plainly until right now. The chronological inversion we just covered, the club that predated the myth adopted visual elements from the myth that was inspired by events that happened a decade after the club's founding, is the kind of historical inversion that people share because it is genuinely surprising, even to people who thought they knew this history. Share this with the person in your writing community who knows the most about motorcycle club history. Let them tell you whether they knew the chronology. Put it in the groups where the serious history conversations happen. Post it to Reddit r/motorcycle history and r/Outlaws MC if those exist in your communities. The oldest outlaw club in America deserves to have its actual timeline known. The Chicago Outlaws did not expand by conquest, they expanded by recognition. On the 4th of July, the documented date specific to the club's official history, the Milwaukee Gypsy Outlaws joined the club. The Milwaukee Club was not absorbed or dominated. They were recognized as sharing the same identity, the same values, the same relationship to the name that the McCook boys had claimed at a field meet decades earlier. The Louisville Gypsy Outlaws followed, and then clubs from Kentucky, Ohio, and Indiana. The pattern was consistent. Clubs from the industrial Midwest had developed independently. They shared the working class, factory worker character of the original McCook group, and they recognized in the Chicago Outlaws something that their own culture already was. In 1964, the Southside Chicago chapter was designated the club's mother chapter, the organizational center of an expanding network that by then stretched across multiple states. On January 1, 1965, the American Outlaws Association, the AOA, was formally constituted. The Outlaws Nation, with Chicago as its mother chapter, had arrived as a national organization. The specific geography of that expansion is the Midwest Industrial Corridor: Chicago, Milwaukee, Indianapolis, Louisville. These are the cities where the factories were. The cities where working class men had been riding motorcycles since the machines became affordable in the 1920s and building a culture around them without any recognition from the California press that was busy documenting the Hells Angels as if the Outlaw Motorcycle Club was an invention of the West Coast. While the national motorcycle press was covering California, Arlen Ness, and the digger culture, the Hells Angels in Oakland, and the custom builders on the West Coast, the Chicago motorcycle culture of the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s was developing in the complete absence of mainstream coverage. The flat roads of the Chicago metropolitan area and the open country began as soon as you cleared the suburban sprawl. The specific character of Midwestern riding included 4 seasons, variable weather, roads that ranged from the smooth expressways of the city to the cracked county roads of the surrounding farm country. Riders rode year-round because they had no alternative, or they modified their machines for winter riding, because a bike sitting in a garage for 6 months is not a working machine. The specific clubs that operated in and around Chicago through this period had a character that was fundamentally different from California clubs because the landscape and the economics were fundamentally different. No year-round sunshine, no Pacific Coast Highway, factory wages rather than the California aerospace and entertainment economy. The specific Midwestern stubbornness that produces a culture of self-reliance, because the conditions that require self-reliance are present for half the year. The Windy City Motorcycle Club, one of the oldest AMA-affiliated clubs in Illinois, is still operating. The independent riding clubs that never sought national affiliation built their community around specific Chicago neighborhoods the way Chicago's culture has always built around specific neighborhoods. None of this was covered. The national motorcycle press went to Daytona and Sturgis and Laguna Seca. It did not come to the Chicago South Side, or to the flat country roads of the northern Illinois Farm Belt, or to the specific gathering places where Chicago riders congregated to talk about machines and roads. The Route 66 corridor from Chicago through Joliet and Pontiac and Bloomington to Springfield and beyond was the primary riding route for Chicago area motorcyclists through the decades when it was still the primary ground transportation route between the city and everything south and west. Before the interstate bypasses made Route 66 obsolete, before the road became a tourist attraction rather than a living infrastructure, it was the road that Chicago riders used. The road that connected Matilda's bar in McCook to the rest of America. The California motorcycle story is real and important. Arlen Ness and the East Bay Dragons and Cliff Voss, the roads and the weather, all produce something genuine. California's contribution to American motorcycle culture is documented and significant. But California's contribution was built on a foundation that Illinois laid. The Outlaws MC, founded on Route 66 in McCook, Illinois in 1935, established the first named outlaw motorcycle club in American history, not California. Illinois. The first major post-war motorcycle event in the Midwest, in May 1946 at Soldier Field in Chicago, established that motorcycle culture in the industrial Midwest had survived the war and was growing, 4 years before California's Hollister became the national media story that defined the culture's image. Route 66, the road that defined American motorcycle freedom in the popular imagination, began in Chicago. The road started at the door. The specific mechanical culture that produced the most competent generation of American motorcycle riders in the 20th century was not a California phenomenon. It was a Midwest industrial phenomenon. The factory workers who understood machines from the inside out. The men who maintained their own motorcycles because the machines demanded it and because the economic conditions required it. The culture that built motorcycles in garages on Saturday mornings because the dealer was too expensive and because knowing the machine completely was the point, not a workaround. That culture was Midwestern. It was from the steel mills and auto plants of the Great Lakes Corridor and the diesel engine factories of the Chicago suburbs. And it was documented by almost nobody until it was too late to document the people who built it.